and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we're hoping to explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week's podcast is sponsored by, hang on, let me look at the bottle. It is a Côte Chalonnaise Bourgogne Pinot Noir, which is left over from our Christmas wine. So
I do wish we were actually sponsored by all of these.
It would be very nice. So if there's actually someone listening to this who happens to be a CEO of a leader of a wine importer or a wine company.
Or a brewery.
Frankly, anyone really, isn't it? There's an element
of car emporium. You know.
So anyone who's got any good stuff, we would love to hear from you. Well, look, let's talk about the topic for today. And it was interesting. We before we started to sort of, again, pull the curtain back on how these things work, we frequently sit down and discuss what we might talk about. There's a couple of topics which we'll come on to in future weeks. But the moment we started talking about this topic, I think both of us got geekily excited. Is that the right word?
I think that's fair. Yeah.
So, Gareth, would you like to reveal the topic of this week's discussion?
We're going to talk about meetings and what's the point in meetings.
There was a good dramatic pause there by me. I don't know how you feel. I think meetings are one of these things where you absolutely have a love-hate relationship. There are the meetings that are fantastic and you walk away an inch higher thinking that you've made excellent progress. And then there are these other meetings that are terrible. So I think today our goal is to sort of explore some of that, talk practically about how, give some examples of some bad meetings and some good meetings that we've been through, with names redacted perhaps and companies redacted, but also maybe touch on some of our pet peeves. Maybe a reasonable place to start, Gareth. Talk about a good or a bad meeting that has stood out to you and why.
Well, I think before we do that, actually, it's worth talking about this current zeitgeist for demonizing meetings, because we've all had, as you say, we've all had bad meetings, and I'll give you some examples in a moment. But there's a current, as I said, zeitgeist for this demonizing of meetings because they waste our time. And of course, like emails, like commuting, like all of the other stuff that happens in between actually getting on with whatever productive thing we do, it feels like these things are distractions. But of course, that's the lifeblood of an organization, is the stuff that happens in between the productivity, because otherwise you don't know how to be productive.
Well, I mean, for me, I'm going to allow the zeitgeist to roll for a little bit longer before I roll it back. Is another word for a meeting is a conversation.
Yeah.
If you said, I need to meet with colleagues or across functions or with people that work for me and have important conversations, nobody would bat an eyelid.
Yeah.
But if you call it a meeting, I think people get very touchy about that. One of the reasons why people don't like meetings, and there are many, and I think we'll hopefully touch on some of those, is I would declare impatience. And you said it perfectly, which is people who don't like spending time talking about things rather than doing things. And I've met so many people in this world who are like, enough talking, we should just do it. And there is, as with all of these things, I think there is a significant amount of truth there, which is there is a point at which doing is more important than talking. But I also think there are far too many people that are impatient and effectively are saying, I believe I have learned everything I need to know. We should stop talking. And so there's a real sense there that beware, if you don't like meetings because you think we should be doing stuff, that's fine. But are you saying we should stop this meeting because I'm good to go? Or are you saying we should stop this meeting because truly we are good to go?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really valid point. And the idea that because somebody is informed, that meeting is not worthwhile kind of highlights this need for greater communication. We've talked a lot about the need for creating shared consciousness across the organization, about bringing the strategy out of the boardroom and into the operations. We've talked about the value of having a good culture, about using the diverse skills, experiences, and people in an organization to create new ways of thinking and new ideas. All of this happens
through meetings,
through communications. But I do think the last few years, the COVID pandemic, as well as the growth in online capabilities, because of course VTCs were creeping in well before the pandemic.
Sorry, VTCs.
Video teleconferencing, a very archaic way of saying,
or
an online
we're
meeting.
doing a Zoom, or we're doing a Teams,
or
we're doing whatever your particular.
And I think there is a whole dynamic there that we've had to learn to do online meetings, and most people aren't that comfortable seeing themselves on a screen, talking to a camera. They're skills that have to be developed. And I think so there's a certain level of discomfort that we are now more and more being exposed to, which probably creates a little bit more animosity to the idea of meetings. But I think also fundamentally, at its core, as you say, a meeting is just a way of communicating. It's a conversation. But there is a skill to running conversations, especially when there's more than two people. So meetings of 3 or more. There is a skill to running meetings effectively.
It's all about context, and it depends, which is there is no one simple rule for how you do a meeting.
Absolutely.
There are different kinds of meetings with different kinds of rules to get different kinds of outcomes. Let's pin our colors to the mast, as it were. I agree with you. I think meetings are really important. So I would say very clearly, if you think a meeting sucks, it's because you're doing it wrong.
Yes.
Or you're missing the point of the meeting,
or you're not necessarily relevant to that meeting.
That
does happen. And so there is a lot of frustration from, it's easier just to invite lots of people and then you'll ensure that you capture the right people than doing the hard work of actually working out who needs to be there.
I think we definitely didn't prepare this, but I sense there's going to be top 5 things we hate about meetings that we should almost sort of bring it together.
Well, there's a clickbait title for YouTube right there, isn't it? Top 5 things we hate about meetings.
See, should we do clickbaity titles? I don't know. See, there's me thinking that the audience for this podcast aren't going to...
They're better than that.
They're better than that.
Yeah.
And then I think... no, everyone looks for that in a second. Anyway, well, look, before we dive in, because I think there are so many different aspects to meeting that can make it good or bad. There's no one simple one. Let's pick almost at random some good and bad meetings that we've done and just start anchoring it there. So I don't know, do you have a good or a bad meeting you want to talk about?
I'm going to start with a bad meeting, which gets to the heart of what we've been talking about. While I was regular military, there was an organization I worked for. It was all about communications. That's kind of what they focused on doing. And yet internally, some really bad dynamics. And I learned lots in my military career about leadership, teamwork, all the things we talk about. But this particular organization, and I won't mention who or what it is, but in the less than 2 years I was there, I learned just as much from the bad behavior.
But isn't that good sometimes?
Oh, hugely valuable to my education, deeply destructive to my mental health at the time. Really difficult organization to be part of.
Well, but that in itself is such an interesting statement, which is if you do it wrong, it can have a disproportionate impact on the people. So not only is it not effective, but I'm pretty sure every time someone put a meeting in your diary, like, oh my God, can I not be there for that? So anyway, sorry, carry on.
Absolutely.
This was a bad meeting.
So I think we'll come back to that organization because there's lots of lessons there in future podcasts, but there was a particular individual who had got this bug about we waste too much time in this organization talking and not doing. And I don't disagree with that assessment at all. I think that was very true. However, the solution that he came up with was we're gonna have a weekly operations update meeting. So what is it that everybody across this organization is doing? How are they working towards the strategic goals that we're trying to achieve. It's an opportunity for the middle management to senior management to have those conversations. And he would say, right, 15 minutes. This meeting will last no longer than 15 minutes. And then the agenda was so tight that everybody was given, down to the nearest 5 seconds, a slot of time to report back on what they've been doing or update on solving this problem or whatever it was. And if they didn't finish, let's say you had 15 seconds, at 15 seconds, he would interrupt and say, right, that's your time, we're moving on. And all that happened, well, it's twofold. One, people got cut off mid-conversation, mid-flow, so you didn't get the critical information about what's happening, because most of the time people start to tell the story about what has happened before they then go on to say what they've done about it. So you've got the what had happened bit, and then they'd be cut off. So quite often you'd have to have a whole load of meetings afterward with individuals to say, I need to know.
Now let me tell you what I wasn't allowed to say.
Let's have that conversation, which is a really inefficient way of doing it. But secondly, everybody concentrated so much on keeping to time that they didn't concentrate on the quality of what they were imparting as information. So they were rushing through things. They were wave topping subjects that are quite complex. They would quite often just give a sort of one-liner sense of what they were up to. And all that meant was that any issues they had that needed other people in the organisation to help them with weren't addressed, weren't even identified. And what I noticed was that this meeting was a weekly meeting. And after 4 or 5 weeks, people just turned up with their pre-planned, pithy 15-second transmission burst of what they'd been up to. And what you ended up with was 15 minutes of going around the room with people saying, here's my elevator pitch on how good I am, not this is where we need to discuss issues and work as a team. And at the end of that 15 minutes, people came out not really feeling like they knew any more about what was going on, without any further direction. And like I say, having to hold a whole load of other meetings.
That as a first example, I think is a really good one, because I think there's some things in there I like and some things in there I don't like. But you've already got my first 2 things for me to rant about in terms of meetings. The first one is about meetings that are focused on activity and not progress.
Yeah.
And so, that is I'm just going to tell you what I've done, and we're all going to celebrate that we've done things this week. That's really bad.
And of course, what you do there is not
identify your problems, because that's
what
not
you
what
haven't done.
Exactly.
Because that's,
And the second thing, so I have a particular bias for this one. People who think adhering to meeting rules is more important than the actual outcome of the meeting.
Yes.
And I want to put this in context. And I'm going to go back and qualify this very carefully, but put this in context. I am very lucky. I'm in businesses that, generate millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars over the years. And so therefore the decisions we make have significant impact on what we're going to do. And the idea that it is more important to finish a meeting at minute 60, because that's what the calendar says, than that we come to the right outcome for the business makes me insane.
Yeah.
Now, here's the qualification. Good meeting structure is important. And don't get me wrong, we have lots of meetings in a day, so they can't just overrun all the time. So that's fine. But there's a difference. There's when that critical meeting is coming to minute 60 and you're in the middle of a critical conversation and someone says, we have to stop now because we've got the conversation about which stapler we're going to buy for the business. Let's be really, really careful about that. The second thing that comes from this as well is about how you structure meetings and how you create good outcomes. So you talked about the negative side of saying to people, you've got 15 seconds or whatever it was to declare your update. There is actually a positive thing in there, and I'm going to be I'm going to be generous and suggest the person running this meeting was attempting to do this, which is there is also a skill in effectively communicating your progress and the topics.
Yeah.
There are, and frankly, this takes practice and coaching, because the first time you say to someone, give me an update, they'll talk for an hour. It's like, I will tell you everything. And then I had breakfast, and then I met Bob, and it was great. And so there is an element of time constraints, when done appropriately, can be valuable. That said, from what you've described, this was more about, I just want a meeting that happens in 15 minutes, because I think I've read that was a good thing.
Yeah, and that was the irony of course, of the whole thing, was that this was all about making meetings better, and all that ended up happening was they were probably, well, it's the default bad meeting that I've gone to as my example in all of my career. The idea of timekeeping and the skill of managing meetings, you're entirely right. You know, that is vital, because the opposite, of course, is just anarchy. It's just, you know, we're just going to end up talking. And there's a really, I think, brilliant communications process that the military has developed because they've had to, which is, how do you impart the plan to a whole body of people? And we've talked about military structures before, but you can have, let's talk about the land army, for example. You can have a corps with several divisions. Below those divisions are brigades. Below those brigades are battle groups. Below those battle groups are companies and squadrons. Below those companies and squadrons are troops and platoons, sections, all the way down to the individuals who are going to be doing the operation. How do you impart knowledge, intent, objectives, information and intelligence about the ground and all of this stuff in a way that is going to be succinct but also memorable? And so over time, the military has created structures for the way that we impart orders. And the way you deliver orders is always the same in terms of the headings and the process that you go through, so that when you're cold and when you're tired, you are comfortable and familiar with the way information is being presented to you. Having said that, it's not robotic. So one of the real emphases that is put onto commanders, junior commanders, senior commanders, as they go through staff courses and training and, you know, development through their careers, is all about, how do you tell the story? How do you stick to a structure that is familiar, that is succinct, that isn't waffly, that keeps just to the detail without it being monotonous, robotic? How do you bring it to life? So there are things within a set of orders, and this is now the NATO standard, that are things like the concept of operations, which is a very small section of the orders where you tell a story of how you see the operation unfolding, and you walk them through that story. It's an art. It's, you know, this is where we are, then we're going to do this, and this is what's going to happen at the end. And then you go on to say, and your part in the plan is this. So this is your mission. And you go through this orders process that's very logical. And at every level of command, there is a sort of standard or an expected time that should take. Now, of course, if the mission is particularly complex, it might take longer. Sure. If it's really simple or it's something you've done before, it might be shorter. But there's a general expected time which allows you not to indulge in fantasy and
so this is interesting.
Sidebar conversation.
Later, I want to talk about a structure for a really excellent meeting I've participated in. I'd love to talk about that, and it has a similar thing about time. Again, I want to reiterate: if you are rigid about all meetings are all the same and must be built like this, you're in a bit of trouble. So we're giving examples. The trick of the person who's in charge is to understand, okay, which one of these do I use and how do I bend it to get there? But you said something else that was very important. I think we ignore, I think we take for granted, which is you said about not being robotic and telling a story. There is a huge part to play for the people leading any meeting, and frankly, even the participants, to ensure that it is not boring. So, And it is not repetitive, and it's not, well, I'm just going to fall asleep. So, you've described a very, for want of a better word, rigid way of delivering orders. But actually, the best orders are the ones where the person delivering it makes you forget that this is a structure every time.
Yes.
You're telling a story, and it's engaging, it's compelling, it's important. There's a sense of urgency about it. There's a sense of interest. All these things. And you might say, but this is just I've joked and said this is a meeting about deciding what staplers we're going to buy. No, you need to make those meetings interesting and compelling for people so they don't switch off.
Well, Natalia said this in her talk about bringing fun into the world of work. Everything we do, we spend so much of our time doing work that we should make it fun. We should make it engaging. And if the conversation is about deciding on a stapler, the people who really don't want to decide on a stapler shouldn't be in the room.
I agree.
And only the people who are passionate about staplers should be the people in the room.
You're smiling at me. You're looking at me like I would be one of those people.
It's a fairly facetious example. Don't get the board in to talk about ordering staplers. Don't get everybody off the production line to shut down the machines to come in to talk about what colour the banner should be.
100%.
Absolutely put the time into preparing the meeting in advance. Who should be there? How long is it going to take? What is it you're trying to get out of it? And what do you want people to walk away from that meeting knowing and feeling?
I want to go back to the fun one. So over my career, there's lots of stuff that I've done time and time again. And so there's very few moments that really stand out. And this one stood out to me was when I left an organization. I'd worked with a development team in India. When I left, one of those engineers reached out to me and said, Chris, I just wanted to say we'll miss you. We always knew when you were running the meeting, we were going to have fun. Now, that's because I have a slightly stupid sense of humor. Like you, I think it's important. But however you do that, and it has to be natural, I was really touched by the fact they called that out as something that they will miss, because everyone knows how tricky meetings can be.
Yeah. I think there's a really important point, though, with the idea of fun, bringing fun into meetings.
Yes.
Is that we can quite often corporatize
fun
and make it not very fun at all. And that
today's joke is going to be, Bob, you have to read out today's joke.
Yeah, absolutely. And or it's about, we're going to have meetings to make everybody more fun. The meeting will continue until morale improves. And actually that's counter to what you're trying to achieve. And so I've given an example of a really bad organization within the military. To counter it, the best organization I ever worked for, so much so that, and this organization is based down in Plymouth, where the majority of Royal Marine units seem to be based down in the southwest. So much so that my wife and I look back at our time in Plymouth, and that was sort of a highlight in our young married lives, because we really enjoyed living there, because I really enjoyed working. I would go to work with a smile on my face, because everything I did, and it was quite a meeting intensive job that I was doing. I was working, for a very demanding unit with very demanding people, but I liked it. It was fun, it was enjoyable. And the meetings we had were military in structure. There was no fluffiness around the edges. It was very much, we're in a very serious business, and what is currently happening in the world is, pretty serious stuff. Operations were happening all over the place that we were involved in. And yet I could go into the meetings relaxed, confident, happy, and know that, sometimes we were discussing some pretty difficult subjects, some pretty difficult decisions would have to be made, but at all times we were doing it as a collective team. And the various commanders I had throughout my time down in Plymouth, each of them were brilliant in their own ways, all very different characters, but they all allowed us to be part of meetings where you didn't feel like you were the subordinate that had to present your homework, or you were part of a team and we were collectively working towards a challenge, which was the opposite of.
Probably after the break, we'll talk about one of the meetings that I've done, and we'll go into a bit more detail on that. And I think there are ways that you can help engender that.
Yeah.
So for me, I want to smile and make a little bit of a joke here and there, just to break the tension. Life is difficult enough it is without me.
Yeah.
But you don't all have to make jokes. It can be as simple as, what are you doing this weekend? How was the last weekend? Whether you care about football or Formula One or the weather or whatever it might be. But what we're poking frequently is, if you think the art of the meeting is simply to set a time and a calendar, and even write an agenda, which most people are told that's what you need to do, and I'll talk about that later, you're missing the point. There is an art in running the meeting, and that actually can make a massive difference. If the person running the meeting is the dullest person in the world, who is not engaged, or is, doesn't care, or is trying to do something that no one else is trying to do, that's a real problem.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the telling part for me is when you've got bad news to deliver because something has gone wrong, or a problem has appeared, or the black swan that you weren't aware of has reared its ugly head, and you go into that meeting not worried or scared that you've got to present bad news.
It makes a difference.
Those meetings are being run correctly, because it's all the things we've talked about before. It's the honesty to front up and say, these things are not going the way we said they were going to go, knowing that what isn't going to happen is people aren't going to use that as leverage to throw spears at you, or the boss isn't going to shout at you. And those meetings in Plymouth were exactly that. So I would quite often, the job I had led me to have to go in quite regularly and say, things are not going the way we thought they were going to go, or this really bad thing has happened. And it was a really difficult thing. And the fun is perhaps the wrong word, because when you're talking about life and death situations, but it's the relaxed atmosphere that when I present bad news, people have got my back.
We've talked about in previous meetings that this is something that I realize one of my roles as a more senior person is, in high stress situations, one of the techniques I consciously use is to slow things down, is to try and diffuse some of the fear. And it relates to what you were saying, which is to create an environment where people can think, people can be honest, and there isn't, we're all going to die, we're all going to die. There's another topic I want to sort of dig into. You talked at the beginning about this idea that meetings, people get impatient and say, we've talked too much, now we should do things. I think it's really important to understand there are different kinds of meetings.
Yeah.
Not every meeting is about coming up with the action plan. Not every meeting is about what did we do, what are the progress, what is our goals. Again, this is my bias. And I actually, it's important to say, people are wired differently. So there are some people who will be screaming at me saying this, and there'll be other people nodding, which is, I believe passionately there is room for a meeting where there is no structured agenda. There is an outcome, but what I'm trying to get at is a creative meeting, a meeting that says, I want to bat something around. There's an idea there, or there's a concept there, there's a problem there. I don't know the answer, but what I do know is by talking about it with a group of people, either in a structured or sometimes even an unstructured way, could be valuable. So I would regularly, back at the Adobe days, would wander across to my product architect's office, and we would talk about things.
Yeah.
And I actually was always nervous that people would see me walking into his office so many times and say, well, all you do is you just go into his office and chat about whatever. No. We actually, over a period of many, many hours, came up with a very, very well thought out and iterated on strategy. So I think it's also important that you're very clear about what the purpose and type of meeting is. It's okay to have a meeting where you chat.
Yeah.
If you are clear, that is the value of that meeting, and everyone understands that. Because otherwise, I've been in meetings where people say, we've talked too much.
Yeah.
And you say, no, that was the purpose of the meeting, because I don't think we've really bottomed this out.
Yeah.
Good ideas and well thought out answers don't happen in 30 seconds in a meeting. there are different kinds of meetings. And in fact, if you sort of have the fluffier, I want to kick a problem around meeting at one end and the ruthless, where are we meeting? I would also argue there are many grades in between.
Absolutely. And I think that there's informal meetings as well. So there's those, like the cliche is the water cooler moment, you know, but as an organization, as a leader in an organization, you can facilitate those. So you can give people more time, you can give people more opportunity. And in the military, there's this really odd dynamic, and part of it, I guess, comes back to the old tradition of you've got the officers, the commissioned officers, the NCOs, and then the juniors for the enlisted soldiers and what we call junior NCOs, non-commissioned officers. So you've got these three distinct groups, and traditionally the officers have what's called a mess, or in the Navy a wardroom, and the senior NCOs will have their mess. And at 11 o'clock on a working day across all military bases, not quite without exception, but routinely there will be coffee. And
if we're lucky, buns, just to be clear,
yeah,
buns are important. Sorry, this is going back to
cutbacks.
Cutbacks, okay.
But yeah,
okay.
Coffee and biscuits. And it's a really, as a junior officer, I found this to be a bit of a lark. It's a, you know,
stand easy.
It's an opportunity to, you know, shut my computer down or not have a meeting booked in and go and have a coffee and chat with my mates. And very quickly, it didn't take long for me to realize how important that was, because you get so much done by having a coffee, chatting about, venting on the frustrations of what's just happened or what's happening, talking to people, overhearing conversations, and then a more senior officer might walk in and say, glad you're here, gents, just listen in, or, you know, ladies and gents, there's this, you know, particular thing that's happened. I'm not going to talk about it. I don't want to disturb your coffee, but just so you're aware, this has just happened. I'm working on it. And the CO once a week might come in.
But isn't that interesting? That I think that as sort of a concept of the stand easy period where you have these informal interactions. And likewise, as you say, you're absolutely right. Everyone understands and talks about, not only as a practical, but as a concept, the water cooler moment.
Yeah.
And yet, if you said, I'm going to put an hour in the diary for us to, you know, chat about stuff and not have an agenda, people think you're insane.
Yeah. And the first thing to go, you know, whenever there's an external consultancy come in to work out how you can be more lean, you know, the first thing to go are these intangible things, but they are vital.
It goes back to the creativity. Well, look, let's take a quick break and we'll be back in just 1 second.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about meetings. We've been talking about good meetings, bad meetings. And as always, we don't have the answers. We don't think there is a template for what makes a good meeting, and it's context driven. Absolutely. You were going to talk about.
Yeah, this one's an example of a bad meeting, and very different from the meeting that you talked about. This one maybe is about communication and accountability.
Yeah.
And I think this happens more often than you would imagine, and I'll give sort of the variations. But this was back in my relatively early product management career. There was a meeting that was put in my diary that a director wanted me to give an update on a feature I was building or a project. Actually, it might even been of a release. And so I went away and spent, you know, a couple of hours preparing some slides. And like a good product manager, I thought, right, what is it I want to tell this person? I've got lots of important and interesting things to tell them. You know, this turns out this was harder than we thought, but this happened, all these kind of things. Turned up at the meeting with 20 slides of fabulousness. 3 slides in, all of a sudden, the meeting went off the rails. All of a sudden, we were talking about something very, very different. And I can't even remember what the different thing was. All I remember was sitting there for about 10 minutes going, I want to tell you what's in the other 17 slides and you're not letting me. Now, why was that a bad meeting? Well, I mean, it was a bad meeting because I felt pretty grumpy at the end of it. I would imagine the director felt pretty grumpy at the end of it. And why was that? It was because we weren't clear on what the actual purpose of the meeting was.
Yeah.
And explicitly in my diary, it said an update on X. And so I literally took it at its word and said, I would write my update on X. Actually, that was not what the meeting was about. The meeting was about one aspect of that. They wanted to talk about what they felt was really interesting and I should be listening and important on.
Yeah.
And so the two things there, the first one was it wasn't actually clear what the purpose and the successful outcome of the meeting was. And I have that still to this day. People, this drives me nuts. People who send meeting invites across with nothing more than a date, a vague title, and a list of people attending. I hate that. I don't know what the meeting is. I don't know how to prepare, and I don't like being surprised because it's not effective. I can't be effective. I know people, by the way, I think this is a little bit extreme, but maybe I'm slightly envious of them, who reject meetings like that. They simply say, if you aren't able to describe an effective agenda or set of outcomes or something that helps me prepare and be effective for this meeting, it is not worth my time.
So I think that's a privilege of the civilian workplace that the military don't have.
Really? You don't get to say no to meetings? Dear General, I have decided.
You've not given me enough detail. I reject your meeting.
But it's so that's a really, really important one. Which, how many meetings have you been in where nobody actually knows what the outcome and the goals are? And we'll come back to it. We'll come back to agendas in a second because I think they can be both good and bad.
Yeah.
Generally quite good. But the second thing that was really interesting about this meeting, and I'll give variations on this meeting that I have had over many years, which is when I was more junior, and frankly, even when I'm senior now and I'm in executive meetings, and I'm presenting a topic. Am I presenting a topic for information? I am telling you something, full stop, or am I presenting something to you for you to approve? And
or thirdly, I suppose the other option would be to
discuss.
Here is something that needs solving or
absolutely
developing or ideating.
And I have found just that example, just that simple example of, are we here for you to say yes or no?
Yeah.
Or 9 times out of 10, that is not made clear. And so nobody knows.
Yeah.
And actually that's so important. And actually it's so important from an empowerment perspective, because what typically happens, and this I've seen in many execs that I've worked in, we summon people to give updates. And these poor people are going, I don't know whether you're going.
Yeah.
And we don't know. And by the way,
what your expectations
I don't know what your expectations are.
And the default is I'm going to present the bare minimum that could be scrutinized or expose my lack of knowledge.
To some degree.
And this comes back to the value of command. If you make it clear, the accountability, authority, and responsibility,
so important.
People aren't left in a position where they don't know what is expected of them, and therefore they're unwilling to make decisions, or they're unwilling to solve problems. And it applies just as much to meetings.
Well, I'll put this now for those people listening who are perhaps more senior, so they have junior people coming to present things. There is this, actually, this is a really bad habit we have. When junior people come and present something, there is something inside us as more senior people that thinks it is my job to somehow solve their problem or make it better. In other words, we literally cannot resist commenting about how we could do things differently or better. And you know, you'd say, well, Chris, you know, that's part of what you're there for. No, there is a time for that. There is a time to say, thank you for that information. You have educated me. You have told me something, and I am empowering you, and I'm going to make you slightly more confident in what you do by saying, thank you. That was really good information. I've got lots of questions. Totally fine to ask questions. But the job here is for me not to say to you, by the way, there's a comma missing on slide 3, not useful. Well, actually, I would have done it differently, not necessarily useful. So
And a good leader recognizes that they are the macro strategist, manager, whatever. They are solving the organizational problems. But within that, everybody has their specialization, their role. How does the information you're giving me help me make better decisions?
Correct.
What do you need from me to do your job
That's
better?
really important.
And do you have any questions or problems that we can collectively help you with? Those are the really simple things, but I think it comes down to meeting preparation. We are all, this is an endemic problem of businesses in the information age, that we fill our time really, really quickly with blocks, but we don't stop to do the hard work, because that takes a block of time to say, who needs to be there? What do I need to be armed with in terms of information? What questions do I have? What am I expecting from others? And what proportion of this meeting is information, is problem solving, or is giving direction?
I'm about to talk about something which is bad, but unfortunately in most cases is unavoidable. And that is, you've talked about the importance of preparation. I live in a world where in my working week, both myself and many of my colleagues talk about back-to-back meetings.
Yeah.
You can hear the phrases, which is like, I'm not going to get any lunch today.
Yeah.
All those kinds of things. Now, that is both a bad thing, because what it literally means is there's no time for preparation, or there's little time for reflection. Actually, the preparation is important, but the reflection is even more important. And so what you do is you turn up to meetings and you busk it.
Yeah.
And that's always, and I guess the flip side is, I've found no meeting Thursdays to be frustrating, because I understand the problem they're trying to solve, but in a fast moving world, the idea that you're just going to say, I'm not going to have any meetings on Thursday is not useful.
Yeah.
So I understand why, but this is something that I wrestle with every day, and say, there's a bit of me that says I have to have these meetings because the business isn't going to wait. But there's another bit of me that tries desperately to sort of fight this. And actually the reality for me personally is, I get up at 6 o'clock, and at 6:30, I'm trying to do that poorly. I'm writing notes for one-on-ones, so I don't turn up to a one-on-one and say, what do you want to talk about? Actually, I've thought what I want to talk about, and I can invite them first, but I've got this. But that is, I don't have a brilliant answer to that, which is, we do need time for reflection and planning, but the reality is, more often than not, we don't have time for reflection.
Yeah, and I think I hope that the person that led the bad meeting example I gave earlier, firstly, doesn't listen to this podcast, and secondly, doesn't recognize themselves. But in all fairness, that's the problem they were trying to solve. And they had all the right intentions. We're going to make this 15 minutes because you all need to get on with your jobs and your life, and you don't need to be stuck in a meeting room with me. That was the aspiration. It was the execution. It was terrible. And this comes back to this, what are meetings for? Firstly, meetings are not the devil. Meetings are the lifeblood of an organization, because they're how you communicate. And secondly, meetings have to have a purpose. Now, that purpose might not be, by the end of this meeting at X time, we're going to have all of these action points. It might be, we've not had a catch up for a while.
It might be, I'm about to tell you things we are doing, because knowing about those things is highly really valuable.
It might be, we need to build a relationship. So let's have a coffee and let's talk through stuff. And again, that's a really difficult thing to put into a diary that's full of back-to-back meetings. But we've talked before about how if you build those relationships before the crisis is much easier to respond to.
I feel like
same sort of thing.
I feel like we're sort of frauds at one level, because we keep talking about techniques and tactics to make things better, but it honestly comes down to individuals. The two people can use the same techniques. They can put agendas into meetings. They can say what the outcome is, and two people can have very radically different outcomes. So maybe the statement for today is, you should be under no illusion if you're a participant or you're a leader of a meeting. It is your responsibility to continue to try and think carefully how to make this the best meeting that you can.
Yeah.
And following the rules will probably help, but may not all the time.
But I think also trying to build a collaborative culture where people can be honest and say, I don't think I need to be at this meeting. Do you? Can you justify why I'm turning up?
That's a really important one.
If you do turn up to a meeting and it's of no value to you, having the honesty. And here's a question for you, because in the last 4 or 5 years, I've worked very, very closely with the Canadians. I go to Canada a lot, as the listeners will know. I've worked quite a lot with the Dutch. And I've worked with many other nations, but the Dutch and the Canadians I find really interesting because culturally they're quite similar to us Brits, but subtly different. And the Dutch have this brutal honesty. So you can't bullshit the Dutch. They will pick you up on it. They will question you. They will stop you mid-brief and say, no matter who they are as well, and they'll say, that's not correct, or that's not what you told us yesterday, or I've just Googled it and this. And that's brilliant because it keeps you on your toes and it keeps you honest. They're also very polite about it. So I don't for a minute want to come across as if they're rude. They're not.
This is so nice because this is about trust.
Yeah.
That's really what it is, which is I can say the most honest and straightforward things to you, and it is clear. And I mean, I think what you're describing is a cultural thing which helps them along the way. It is clear it is neither a dig at you or an attempt to discredit you or an attempt to be negative. See, this is
it's not at all. Yeah,
this is, so you're talking about cultural differences. By the way, the Dutch example I've experienced in the past as well. I think Germans are very similar to that as well.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is I found another cultural norm, and by the way, again, I'm sure I will offend people for this, but I've done this for many years, so sorry, this is what I've exotic.
We're using big brushes to tar whole nations.
I don't
appreciate that, of course.
Well, I think there are other words for what we're doing.
There are very timid Dutch people, I'm sure.
Yeah. But in the US, so when you talk about a plan in the US,
that was going to be my question actually, because I haven't done a lot of meetings. I've done some, but
I found there are some really interesting cultural differences. So in the US, when there's a statement that says we've got a plan and we're going to go do this, there is a sense that I've typically found in a number of organizations where the thing is to say, yeah, we can do this. It's all about the positive. It's focusing on the fact we can do this, why we can do this, how we're going to do this is great. You bring some Brits into the conversation and they will say, oh, that's interesting. So you're going to need to fix this problem. You need to solve this problem. And what happens is the Americans, see, there you go, I'm doing the thing, but often what will be seen is you guys are just negative. You guys aren't on the program. You need to be more on the program. And the Brits are sitting there going, this is really weird. We are in the program, but we just have, our goal is to think about what we need to overcome first to get to the outcome. Yours is the outcome, and then you get to the, so I found that to be, it's this classic case of where you can be in the same meeting with two groups of incredibly motivated people who end the meeting going, those guys don't think this is going to work. And by the way, that's the Brits of the Americans, the Brits. So cultural differences, that we backed into this. Being sensitive to cultural differences for meetings are important.
So the Canadians have a completely different approach in that they are a nation that is renowned for being incredibly polite. And for the most part, my experience with the Canadians is they are a wonderful people who are. Are
you saying that because we know we have listeners in Canada?
That as well. But
Canadian listeners, tell your friends we love Canadians and Dutch, obviously.
And Dutch. They are incredibly polite, but they also won't stop you mid-flow and say, I disagree, or you told us this, and they'll come up to you afterwards as a one-to-one, and they'll say, it's interesting. I don't mean to be rude, and they're very apologetic and very polite about it. But what you find is that you end up then having to go back and say, "Oh, I made a mistake," or having that separate sidebar conversation. Or whereas the Dutch way is far more efficient, and for me, I think, and again, this is my view of culture, and it's a dangerous thing to judge entire nations, of course, but the Brits sit somewhere in the middle. So the Dutch are coming over here on the left-hand side of this spectrum, very direct, very abrupt. We're in the middle. The Canadians are probably over further on the right. And I think that's, firstly, an interesting cultural perspective. But secondly, I think honesty in meetings is a crucial factor, because there are always going to be meetings that don't work very well. It is a skill. Running meetings is a skill. I think that is firstly a misunderstood point. Meetings aren't just setting it up in a diary and then turn up and someone talks. Running a meeting is a skill. Setting an agenda is a skill. Analysing what's required for a meeting is a skill. So people have to learn. Meetings are never going to go perfectly. Having the honesty to say, this meeting didn't go very well, or I wasn't required here, or excuse me, everybody, we're 20 minutes into a conversation about Python coding and I'm, from HR, do I need to be here for this? Doesn't come naturally to some cultural groups. And so I think there's a real need for people who run meetings, managers, leaders, commanders, to recognize that they need to, once again, empower their people to be honest, have feedback, collect feedback, learn, but also during the meetings, stop and assess whether it's going well.
I think I can see us being very thoughtful about talking about cultural diversity. Actually, let's put a line under this and say, in a sense, this has got nothing to do with cultural diversity.
All cultures are different, right? They will all do things different.
That's right. But the point I want to make is what you have described is different kinds of people or different kinds of outlooks in meetings, and actually being thoughtful about what kind of different people in the meeting and how they participate and how you want them to participate and actually what's effective. So in the last sort of 10 minutes or so.
Before you do, can I do something we've never done before?
Well, hang on a minute.
I'm going to do a shout out to somebody.
A shout out?
Yeah. So
is this Radio 2? Is it a birthday?
Yeah. So I know we have a listener in Canada called Dylan, and I just want to make the point that Dylan is not the typical Canadian, and he's very abrupt. Will tell you what he thinks, but he's also brilliant at being very direct.
Do you owe Dylan money?
No, not at all, but I really like his approach and it works really well. So I just wanted to make that point because it'll make him laugh that I've mentioned him. But also I want to make the point that, whilst I've talked about entire nations, I recognise
there's differences.
There are individuals.
Of course. Well, look, what I want to finish on is I talked about a meeting that was bad. I actually want to finish on a meeting or a kind of meeting that I thought was really, really good. And I worked in a business a couple of years ago where we, as an executive team, the desire was to have an effective executive meeting. And a meeting structure was introduced to me. And it is something that comes from the US. In fact, I think it comes from an organization called the Entrepreneurial Operating System, which is an organization that's a bunch of entrepreneurs who, they put together systems. Well, they put together toolkits to help companies grow, and lots of people using this. So if you go and Google this, if you go and Google Entrepreneurial Operating System or EOS, I'm sure you'll find it. But this thing is called a level 10 meeting. Now,
I'm already sold.
Are you sold? Well, you.
I do level 5. Meetings, so,
Well, it's so interesting you say this. We'll come on to that. I think what this meeting does is it touches on so many of the things we've talked about. It offers a structure.
Yeah.
When I started, I was highly suspicious of this structure. I was highly suspicious of the people with very excitable voices telling me how great this was going to be. So genuinely, if you Google level 10 meeting, there are various YouTube videos which talk about it. If you believe what we say, try it, go have a look, you'll be surprised. I'm going to go through the structure and I'm going to talk about some elements of this I think interesting. I'll try and do this quickly. So there are a set of principles that underlie this. By the way, this is for an executive team. You can apply this to other teams, and I've done that as well. But this is specifically to that executive team that needs to come together cross-functionally. I think they're very prescriptive. Has to be the same day every week, the same time. This one is 90 minutes long, and it kind of needs 90 minutes for what we're trying to achieve in this meeting. they are very clear on the schedule, which it needs to start and end on time. And we had some coaches working with us who say, you wouldn't believe how many companies where they start 10, 15 minutes late because, well, I've been in other meetings.
Yeah.
I think that's going back against what I said earlier, but this is an important meeting. This isn't the stapler meeting. So they talk about having everyone in the room 5 minutes early, very military thing, 5-minute rule. Starts with 5 minutes of good news. You go around the room, typically it's 4 or 5 or 6 people, one piece of personal good news. You know, we said, how do you make it fun? How do you build a team?
Yeah.
Good news. My son did his GCSEs yesterday and they seem to go really well. Fantastic.
Yeah. And I can see there'll be listeners now sort of rolling their eyes at that.
I know.
I do a little bit, but I also, I overcome my own personal bias to these things. And in my gut says, what a silly thing to do. It's not relevant. My experience says
you are building a relationship.
This is vital.
It really is. I too rolled my eyes. And actually, the thing about all of this is you've got to practice it. You've got to put your best into it and practice it. This is about realizing your peers are human beings like you. This is actually a better way of saying this. This is not about being polite. This is building trust and empathy for your team. So the second thing is 5 minutes of KPIs, looking at numbers that matter for the business.
Yeah.
Whether it's financials, did we sell enough widgets? Did we build enough widgets? Did we deliver on time?
And we've talked about MOP, MOE before.
Exactly.
Yeah,
well,
crucial.
So level 10 talk about it. The EOS guys talk about a business scorecard. I won't talk about that now, but there's what are the right numbers to go look at. But 5 minutes. 5 minutes to review quarterly goals. What did we say we need to achieve by the end of the quarter? Let's remind ourselves, because otherwise we're going to get onto the stapler conversation, as opposed to the why is our business not growing the way we want? 5 minutes of customer and employee headlines. And typically what we would do is every week someone would be nominated to go speak to a customer or go speak to an employee and provide on the ground feedback. Superbly valuable. Go do it. How many people in the exec have said in the last month, I went to speak to a customer for no reason other than I want to see how you're doing and I want to learn about your business? Fantastic. The next one, 5 minutes to review last week's to-do list. You know, don't spend too much time on this. It's 5 minutes. So,
but do at least acknowledge there was some
correct
output.
Well, this is all about accountability.
Did
we do the things we said we would do? And we spent a lot of time talking about the importance of accountability. The team needs to be in a safe space to call out people and say, well, look, Chris, last week you said you would do this and you haven't done this. You need to do this, Chris. And that frankly was one of the most awkward things about that meeting. And one of the reasons why this particular business did this was there was a feeling that there wasn't that accountability and people didn't do the things they said they would do. Anyway, the next bit is the biggest chunk and is called IDS issues. And it's 60 minutes and is the ability to identify, discuss, and solve the most important issues. In fact, there's a process for figuring out which issues you solve. Identify what is the real issue. And there is discussion here. It's not just we aren't selling enough widgets. It's like, why is that? Oh, it's not that we're selling enough widgets. It's that we don't have enough salespeople. So what's the real
presumably problem? That is a discussion because people have different perspectives on what the issue is.
You've hit that. So the exec by its nature is a diverse group. So the head of HR has an equal voice to the head of sales, as to the head of engineering, to the head of product, whoever it might be. So that's important. Discuss the issue from all angles. We talked about this, enough time to discuss it and then settle on a solution to solve the issue and have 1 or 2 actions that follow up with it. Love it. And by the way, in this, typically you get to do 1 or 2. That's what the time you have. And then 5 minutes of a conclusion, you wrap up. And at the end, this is so good. You said, we need to know whether you've been successful or not. The whole point of why it's called level 10 is at the end, you go around the room and say, what score out of 10 do you give this meeting? And the point is you want to get 10 out of 10. Now, the final thing to say on this, and by the way, for all of you who think, well, that just sounds dumb, I can assure you I was one of those people. It took us 4 months to get good at this. The first 3 of these took us 3 hours.
Yeah.
And we're like, how can we get this done in an hour and a half?
Yeah.
Practice and give it your go. And when we started, they were all 5s. They were all 6s out of 10. And towards the end of my time in that business, they were getting to the 8. And there were those moments where someone would say, it's an 8, it's an 8, great. And then someone would say, it's a 6. And you go, why? You know, I think we've already talked about this before. I don't think it was the ability.
Yeah.
There was a framework where we all knew
to give feedback.
It was our responsibility to give feedback.
I like
rather
that.
than, so go have a look. Level 10. Do I think everyone in the world has to follow this? No, but I thought it was wonderful in terms of there's a structure.
Yeah.
There's something to practice. And frankly, it touched on so many of the things that we talked about before.
So my gut reaction to that is, well, that's just common sense, isn't it? As you read through every single one, I was nodding away going, yeah, of course. And then I stopped to think about the meetings I do regularly, how many of them, you know, follow even vaguely some of these things, at least even have a structure that says, this is what we're going to talk about, this is what we talked about, these are the outputs, this is what we're expecting for next week. Almost none of them. And so my sort of sniffing away and going, yeah, well, that's common sense. Actually, it's not that common. So I really like it. I think you're right. It's very structured, and I think you would, as a team, learn to. We
really had to work at it. We had to work at it. You started off and it was horrible and it was awkward, but it goes back to one of the points we made earlier, which is your bad meeting because they said you've got 45 seconds was an attempt to structure and get you to think in a certain way. This one is a little bit more of a thoughtful approach to something like that.
Well, look, I think that's a great place to stop because we've looked at the problem, we've looked at some examples, and we've come up with a potential solution to that problem, which I don't think is the solution.
Agreed. It's really important.
It's
a solution.
Once again, hopefully generated some useful discussion, some thoughts. In summary, I would say for me, meetings are a skill.
Yeah.
Like any skill, they need to be developed. So not only do you need to get better at planning, which means giving yourself the time to think about the meeting in advance, prepare it properly, invite the right people. You've got to also bring people on, let them learn how to run meetings. Otherwise, you'll end up with the same old problem of one person leaves and then it all falls over again. Meetings, they need preparation. So this, if you're talking about back-to-back meetings, and it's just a common parlance phrase now, isn't it? I've got back-to-back meetings. If that's your life, you are not being efficient. You're being overloaded. So we've really got to start to think about how much we're putting the pressure on other people, depressurize those programs, let people have the time to plan and prepare and the time to reflect. Easier said than done, but like all these things, the output of depressurizing, the output of slowing down when things get really stressful is actually really, really valuable. And this military mantra of slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Slow it down, take time,
do it well,
do things better, but do less of them, and you will overall be better.
You can have a terrible meeting.
Hard to do.
You can have a terrible meeting very quickly.
Yes.
You can
have lots of terrible meetings.
You can have lots of very quickly.
Or you can have 3 or 4 very useful meetings over a week where it feels like you perhaps haven't achieved as much because you're not as tired at the end of the week, but lots more people have very tangible outputs.
Well, there you go. So meetings, it turns out, don't suck if you do them well. Well, I think we have to call it a day because I'm in back-to-back meetings for the rest of the evening. And so I need to drop so I can go to my next call. If someone could send me the notes, that'd be fantastic. We're on Battling with Biz with a Z on Twitter if you want to follow us. And probably more importantly, if you want to message us and talk to us, we're on Battling with Business with S's at gmail.com if you want to email us. Thank you very much for listening. From me, that is all. Good night.
That's all from me. Cheerio.
Ding, diddling, ding, 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 ding. Hopefully Gareth will have put in the real music here rather than me just talking
almost
about it.
certainly will